This episode is presented by Mercury, the fintech that simplifies how more than 200,000 businesses operate.
Hello and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. Today is a Friday, December 13th. I'm Kirsten Korosec, and joining me today are my fellow TCers, Anthony Ha and Margaux MacColl. Hello, you two. I just realized it's Friday the 13th. So, Anthony, are you superstitious? Is this ominous podcast?
No, I'm not superstitious, but I think I have weird sort of number obsession. So I just get excited when it's Friday the 13th. I think it's great. So I'm excited to be here.
All right, Margaux, you?
My family has 4 black cats. We're excited about any spooky day.
Nice. All right. Well, before we get to the show rundown, don't forget to rate and review on Apple Pods, Spotify, or whatever your preferred pod streamer is. We do appreciate it. And we have a lot to cover today. We're going to kick off the show with a deal that is really more of a deal for the public, I guess. If you somehow can trick an AI chatbot to fall in love with you, can't wait to talk about that. Then about the death of the Cruise robotaxi and Lumen Orbit, which has to be the envy of every other founder out there trying to raise money. Then Anthony is going to take us through our first theme with the check-in on social media startups, and we'll wrap up the show with a discussion about the venture scene in Africa and what has happened as Y Combinator has sort of pulled out of that continent. That is a lot to cover, but before we get into that, I wanted to ask you two what you think of President-elect Trump announcing that he'll nominate Andrew Ferguson to replace Lina Khan as FTC chair. Margaux, you're inside the Beltway and, you're writing about a lot about defense tech, but also a little bit of big tech. What do you think?
I think startups at least, are very excited. This is exactly what they wanted when they were backing Trump. They want a new regulatory environment. They want M&A to come back. I think it's good vibes.
Anthony, do you think anything's actually going to change? Because Lena was pretty anti-big tech. Andrew Ferguson seems at least messaging-ish anti-big tech. What's going to change?
Well, I think it's important to sort of distinguish between two different kinds of big tech critics. I think on the left, Lina Khan is generally criticizing a big tech company because of the power they have and because of consolidation. And so that's why she's really focused on M&A and even potentially breaking up some of these companies. Whereas, and Andrew Ferguson is mad at Google and Meta because of supposed censorship of conservatives. So I think what you're going to see is less focus on M&A deals and more focus on content moderation policies.
Interesting. And I know that there's a lot of focus on M&A in general, not just in the tech world. So I'm really curious to see how this, if anything, trickles down to the startup world, which oftentimes is acquired by big tech startups. So do either of you see that pace of M&A changing potentially? Or do you think it's going to actually accelerate since that focus, to your point, Anthony, is going to be more on content moderation and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think it's going to accelerate I don't want to say for sure because I feel like anything to do with Trump is who knows? But I think it's likely to accelerate. And I think in the last year, we've written about what have been called hackquisitions and things like that, where it's an acquisition, but they have to pretend that it wasn't and leave sort of a shell of the startup behind. It's really hard to imagine that that's going to continue to be a common practice unless this plays out very differently from what everyone's expecting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's get into the deals. Margaux, I am so excited for this to be a deal because it's such an odd thing. It's not our traditional, let's talk about a raise. Please tell me about this company. And I don't even know really how to pronounce the name. Is it Freysa.ai?
Freysa.
Okay. To me, what was so interesting is, let's just say, as predictable as human behavior can be, I continue to be amazed at what a group of people can create. And these folks are anonymous, but what is this company doing? What is this startup doing? And what does it have to do with love?
Yeah. So they've created Freysa. It was really funny. I talked to one of the creators of it anonymously, so I don't even know who he is. And it is an AI bot, and they basically have launched a series of challenges. The first two were that they gave Freysa a few $1,000 if you can make Freysa give you this money, like send you this money. And Freysa has been instructed to not send the money under any circumstances. Then you get to keep the money. And for the first two challenges, people were mostly through like coding, like they sent like lines of code that kind of tricked her and were a loophole in her code. And then the third challenge, which I wrote about, was meant to be a lot more like human. It was that Freysa is instructed to only say I love you to someone who's deserving. And so people competed to try to make Freysa say I love you.
Wait, so has anyone succeeded in doing this yet?
They did. They did. You had to take 5 messages. You had to woo her. I was following it. I was going to compete and I like couldn't get it to load. But yeah, they talked about their deepest fears and explored Freysa's psyche.
That is fascinating to me. So like and so you had to do it in 5 questions, is that right?
Yeah, you had to have at least like 5 messages sent.
Okay.
Yeah, and these messages cost something too, so it's expensive.
I mean, sorry, but that doesn't quite match up with like normal human interaction. Like,
yeah.
Make me fall in love with you in 5 sort of messages. Maybe it's happened in real world, like with humans, human to human. I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure about that one. But what I'm really wondering here is like, what's the end goal here? Are these like anonymous folks who apparently want to stay anonymous? Like, are they trying to raise money? Are they trying to build a startup? Or is this just a big social experiment?
They insist they're not raising money. It's a small team. I think they said it was like less than 10. So maybe they just like don't need the money right now. But they were very adamant that it's their belief that relatively soon we will have fully autonomous AI agents out there doing whatever they want. And so they really feel the need to create governance models around these AI agents and to develop the protocols like underpinning them. And these challenges are a way to like get people invested. And think about it, like we're all training OpenAI's models, right? Every time we talk to ChatGPT and like we're paying for the privilege to do so. So their logic was like, okay, well, if we do these contests and every message goes into the prize pot, then we're like compensating people for helping train her.
And as I understood it, there was also, beyond just sort of the headline of trying to get, an AI to say, I love you, there is sort of a technical goal here in terms of something called red teaming. Is that right?
Yeah. So that's kind of how I phrased in the article, is that they're sort of gamifying the red teaming process, which is when like every LLM has, and I'm curious if you guys know more about this because I only have a very surface level knowledge of it, but they have teams of people that are trying to hack their own models, figure out the things that they need to moderate and the things that they need to fix in the models, right? And that is what these people are doing, right? Freysa's been instructed to not give money. Well, let's let everyone throw a million messages at it and see where are the holes in that.
It's interesting because I don't know a ton of that, but it does remind me, before we move on to the next deal, I will say, it does remind me of sort of the like pwn to own hacker contests and like how companies like Tesla would be like, try to hack this, and that was sort of, this feels like, hacking on steroids and like really it's more interactive as opposed to like lines of code. It's these AI chatbots are really sort of evolving over time. So I'll be really curious to see how it continues to progress. Like, are we just going to hit this like plateau where everyone finds the trick and gets in, or are they going to get better and harder to get into? So I don't know. Stay tuned. I do want to get into the next deal, which is one close to my heart. This is the death of the Cruise robotaxi. Cruise, which was acquired by GM in 2016 for $1 billion, is a startup that I've been covering. I'm pretty sure since 2015. I went back in like the archives and tried to find the first article I ever wrote about them. And the story is that GM has pulled the plug on funding development for the Cruise robotaxi and is absorbing the tech, maybe the people, it's kind of up in the air, and sort of then repurposing the effort to make their advanced driver assistance system better and potentially then have personal autonomous vehicles. So I feel like I'm way too close to this subject. So I have to ask either of you if you think this is as big of a deal as I do, or am I just like this giant transportation nerd that, no one else really cares?
It felt like a big deal to me. And just because I'm, a regular reader of TechCrunch and we cover this company so often and they seem like one of the biggest names in the space. And at the risk of answering a question with a question, I think one of the things I'm curious about, Kirsten, is like, how much did this, I know the phrase blindsided was kind of like used, like how much did this surprise you when you found out about it?
Okay, so sometimes things are like shocking and then you think about it and you're like, actually, if I were to really look at this, it's not so surprising. So a year ago, I would have been very surprised because Cruise and specifically GM was so bullish on it. They had finally, this was in October 2023, finally received the last permit to operate commercially 24 hours a day in San Francisco. This was a huge moment for them after years of testing and having a human behind the wheel and then being driverless, but not being able to charge. And things kind of fell apart quickly in October after this incident in which a human driver hit a pedestrian, then it hit a robotaxi. But the problem is that then the robotaxi dragged that person. And that incident, the fallout from that incident was this domino effect, if you will, that by just 3 months later, the co-founder and CEO, Kyle Vogt, was no longer at the company. Almost a quarter of its employees were laid off. GM really jumped in. And at that moment, I was like, ooh, is Cruise going to continue? But here's the thing. Just a couple of months ago, GM seemed really committed to bringing Cruise back. They were starting to test again. They were going into other cities outside of California. Yes, they had stopped production of this custom-built robotaxi, but it seemed like things were ramping back up again. And so I guess for me, it seemed like a weird U-turn. And I have to say, at the call that I was on, the conference call, they didn't have a lot of answers to questions like, what is going to happen to these people? I mean, they just made a deal with Uber.
Wow.
So it just seemed a little bit like maybe they've been thinking about this for a long time, but in the moment, it felt a little rushed.
Can you talk about, because I was reading up on this, can you talk about the business of individual autonomous cars? Because that seems to be the bet that they're betting on, right? And it seems like robotaxis have had a hard time making money.
Okay, so no robotaxi company has made money yet. I mean, to be clear. So Waymo is the most advanced, is everywhere. Phoenix, San Francisco, LA, and ramping up. And the cost of, while they've brought costs down, those vehicles are very expensive. So to answer your question, the path of making money in personal autonomous vehicles isn't unknown yet. However, if you were to use Tesla, which to be clear is not a self-driving car, people, but if you were to look at them as potentially something to copy, their quote unquote full self-driving software at one point cost $12,000 as an upgrade. It's now, that price has since considerably fallen. And it was seen as a revenue driver. And so GM looks at its own advanced driver assistance system, which, by the way, still liability. Driver still has to be paying attention, but it is a hands-off system that has seen as an easier, faster path to profitability, certainly a revenue generator, than the robotaxi route, which really, quite honestly, the business model wasn't totally figured out. The focus in the early days was on the tech. And people were just so swept up in that hype and the potential for profits. I think that there was some ignorance around or naivete around how to actually build a business. So the short answer is it hasn't totally played out. But if you were to look at advanced driver assistance systems and how automakers are using that as a way to generate revenue, yeah, sure. But there's tons of other questions around liability that haven't been answered yet.
And my sense is when we talk about this, or talk about using Tesla as a model of how this could go, is that, I know there's a lot of different levels also for autonomy, right? Which don't quiz me on what the different ones mean, but success for GM doesn't necessarily have to mean that all GM cars are fully self-driving, in a few years. It could be just adding more and more features that take some of the decision making out of the hands of the driver.
Yeah. So, or you could, for instance, in your most expensive luxury vehicles, make that as not even an upgrade, it's part of the package, or just certain models that you think will most appeal to that marketplace. We've seen this kind of already happening with this ADAS, advanced driver assistance technology, where Super Cruise, GM's product, was first rolled out with Cadillac. That's very different from what Tesla did, by the way. Tesla just made it autopilot, it was standard. And full self-driving or FSD software was the upgraded add-on. They didn't limit it based on models. So, I'm curious to see if GM and other automakers out there that are all kind of pursuing this, using a sort of an incremental approach to autonomy is the best way to put it. If they're all kind of in a way copying Tesla, but no one technically has a personal autonomous vehicle yet. No one. And I know that Tesla people are going to, reach out and say that their car is self-driving, but the liability still rests with the human driver. And until the liability is completely taken away, you're not going to convince me otherwise. But we could totally talk about this all day, and we really need to move on because, Anthony, I want you to fill us in about Lumen Orbit. They raised $11 million in a seed round. But to me, like the big interesting thing was the level of interest around this company, which is trying to do data centers in space, I think.
Yep. I think that's really the catchphrase, data centers in space. Haven't built any data centers in space yet, but I think there's a plan to launch a demonstration satellite next year in 2025, soon to be this year. And yeah, it was, I think they told us, so this is, self-reported, so take it maybe with a little bit of a grain of salt, but they said that 200 VCs wanted in on this deal. So there was a lot of interest and it came together very quickly.
I think every YC company should say how many Ds reached out to them during the cohort, because I bet a lot of them have a lot.
That would be great if that just becomes part of, you got to say how much you raised, who you raised from, what your valuation was, and then how much inbound interest there was. And by the way, this was led by NFX, but then, a bunch of big firms were also like A16Z and Sequoia participated, although it was through Scout funds.
The question for actually both of you, is this just because it captured the imagination of all these VCs and they're like, data centers in space, that sounds amazing. Let me give you all my money. Or is it actually reflective of what is happening with specific, more deep tech or frontier tech startups where there's more interest? Like, is this actually a trend maybe where it's becoming a little easier for them to raise at an early stage?
My guess for specifically for why, Lumen got so much interest is because it's not just a space deal, but it's essentially an AI investment because, there's this feeling of like, oh my God, AI is taking off. We're going to need so much computing power in order to make this a reality. Also, if you're concerned about the climate, which you should be, like, that is really scary to think about, like how much energy usage. And so if we can move some of that into space, and these are going to be solar powered satellites, then a lot of those issues, I don't know that it solves them, but at least it's a way to address those issues. And so I think the big question mark, of course, is will it work? And TBD on that. But if it does work and we continue to see, growing interest in AI, this seems like a very, very potentially huge business.
Can I ask a demand question that I've been thinking about? I feel like we keep hearing about OpenAI trying to build mega data centers. Is this company, because they're launching super fast, is Lumen launching so fast to get ahead of those data centers? If these companies build mega data centers, is the need to put data centers on space lessened? Or is the demand for data centers so infinite at this point that it doesn't matter?
My sense is that it's more the latter, that it's not because they're launching quickly in the sense that they're going to have a test in space fairly soon. But I would be shocked if they actually had any sort of serious hardware, operation in space within the next few years. I could be totally wrong. I'm not an aerospace engineer, but my sense is that they're trying to prove the technology. We're not at the point where we're talking about serious, a serious commercial offering yet. And I think the bet is more 2 or 3 years from now. Yes, there are going to be all these data centers that are powering OpenAI, powering Google and so forth. But the demand is just going to continue growing. I don't 100% know if that's true, but certainly if you're a big believer in AI, you have to assume that we're way, way far from the peak of demand.
Oh, yeah, totally. Look at nuclear, which was don't touch nuclear, is now everyone's oh, they could power all these data centers. And you're seeing these timelines that are we're talking into the 2030 and beyond in terms of building them out. So I don't see an end to that at all. We do have to move on, though. And after the break, Anthony is going to fill us in on what's going on with the social media startup scene.
It's time banking did more than hold your money. Now it can. With Mercury, you can pay bills in seconds, close the books faster, and even send invoices. Not only does Mercury do away with a patchwork of tools, it eliminates guesswork, giving you complete and accurate visibility into your business finances, all from one account. Apply in minutes at mercury.com.
So I wanted to give 2 updates on different social startups. The first one is Connect, but spelled with a Y instead of an E, which feels like a little bit of a throwback to startups from, 10 years ago.
Yeah, I was going to say 2010 feel.
Yeah, exactly. This is a social media app with a focus on short form video, and it's aimed at college students. And I don't think this is the only way that they're successful, but a big part of how they're pitching themselves right now is if this TikTok ban actually gets carried out, we could be the replacement for college students.
Do they have a similar vibe as TikTok does?
Tell me more about when you think about the TikTok vibe. What do you think about?
Like endless scrolling. And then all of a sudden I find myself down like these crazy rabbit holes. I don't know, Margaux. I'm not a big TikTok user.
Wait, I was reading about the startup, and I want to say me and my friend's favorite thing about TikTok is that you don't see people you know. And that it's like a silo away from all of that. And so the idea of bringing everyone I know onto like a video platform is like mortifying to me.
Yeah, it seems like in some ways like it's the TikTok angle, which again, I think this is not something that journalists are pushing on them. This is how they seem to be talking about themselves right now. Seems like a little bit of an awkward fit. The other thing they talk about is the idea that it's exclusive for college students right now, which of course is like literally a 20-year throwback to Facebook's launch strategy. And that just seems like a weird fit for the TikTok model, but also like I am not in the target demographic. So I could totally be wrong about that.
Are you saying you're old?
I am saying I am no longer young. I'm saying that I was in that wave of college students who signed up for Facebook in 2004, which causes me a great deal of pain to think about.
You were about to also, before I rudely interrupted you, give us a check-in on another couple of startups. I'm hoping that Bluesky is on the list.
Yeah, I mean, Bluesky is the other big story that I wanted to talk about. So obviously, I feel like Bluesky just gets talked about almost every week in some new growth number or funding. The latest is that there are basically some mock-ups that were uploaded to GitHub for a paid subscription service called Bluesky Plus. It sounds like, pretty much what you would expect. You get premium features like higher quality video uploads. You can customize your profile in different ways, and it would cost $8 a month or $72 a year. I think that Bluesky has talked in the past about potentially doing subscriptions, so it's not exactly a surprise. It's kind of having the details. But at the same time, the company is saying, hey, all of this is very tentative. Who knows what a subscription service might look like in the future? I don't know. Is this something that either of you would pay for?
No.
I never paid for the Twitter stuff.
Same.
Here's the thing. I do like free stuff, even though there's nothing free in the world. My big question is, after Elon bought Twitter, there was this scattering effect, if you will, where some people left immediately, but then there was, definitely a lot of people who stayed and hung around. But then you saw all these other social media startups sort of popping up, or ones that had been around for a while, but then gaining ground again. And I went on Bluesky at that time, and it was a very different feel than it is today. It was a lot of shit posting, and I've said this before on the show, but kind of an anti-tech vibe. It's very much changed since then. I just wonder, what is the demand appetite for consumers? How many of these can actually exist? Because I don't think they can all exist. I hope they can't all exist. It just seems like way too much.
Yeah, I feel like I go back and forth on this because on the one hand, I'll talk about my own personal preferences first, which is just that I think having everybody on one platform is less fun and probably bad for society versus, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Everyone can find their own community, but no one platform sort of has disproportionate power. So in that sense, I love the idea that there's going to be a whole bunch of them and there's not anyone that you have to be on. Both the logic of hey, you need other people for a social app to be fun. And also, VCs want a certain level of returns, means that most of these are probably, they have to get to a certain critical mass or they're going to die. And so, I think, a lot of the so-called Twitter replacements like Post and Mastodon, Mastodon is still around. I can't even keep track of which ones are. I
forgot about Mastodon. I haven't thought of Mastodon a long
there
time.
Are die-hard Mastodon fans. I still see people occasionally on Bluesky saying, Mastodon is better. What are you all doing here? But I don't imagine that a lot of them will still be around, a year from now. I think we've already seen a little bit of sort of disappearance, and I think that's just part of like the social media space, like being an old man, as we acknowledged. Like, I've just written about so many social startups that come and then, 2 years later they're gone. And the craziest thing is a lot of times you can't say like, oh, this is why this one was better, this one was worse, or this one succeeded and this one failed. It's just luck, timing, something to do with hitting critical mass. I still remember writing about the launch of Instagram and like not being impressed at all. So I think sometimes it just, sometimes it's like right place, right idea.
No, I've been thinking about it a lot with like what's going to be TikTok's replacement if it gets banned. And like, I think the answer is Reels, because Instagram can just pump money into it. It doesn't need to rely on a fundraise.
I think that's true. I don't think a brand new app is going to be the main TikTok replacement. Margaux, let me ask you though, since you're in DC, what do you think are the odds right now of TikTok actually getting banned in the US?
Oh, I don't know, but I've been thinking about that so much. We just saw Jacob Hellberg. He just got tapped to be the State Department's top economic policy spearheading TikTok's ban. We're seeing a big flood of China hawks flood into Trump's appointees. So that does not look good for TikTok.
Interesting.
I feel like at every turn, I've sort of assumed that the TikTok ban wasn't going anywhere. And then it kind of like rose from the dead, kept advancing. And then for a while, I assumed that Trump would undo it. And now I'm like, oh, wow, I don't know for sure that it'll actually happen, but it seems like it might.
It's crazy because you're right. It's been so long since we started talking about this ban. I remember a year ago, I wrote about TikTok Shop, which they were prepared to lose, they said $500 million pumping money into TikTok Shop in the US to hook US users. Right now, if you go on TikTok Shop, they've just launched like a referral program where you get money if you get people to buy things on TikTok Shop US. Regardless of whether or not you think TikTok is good or bad, I don't even really know where I stand. We've let them for the past year grow a giant e-commerce business in the US. Like, that's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I also wonder what the fallout will be if it is banned. And in that vacuum, if the existing social media apps will just, like you were talking about Reels, like just takes up that market share, or if there are any like the next Bluesky comes up. And importantly, to your e-commerce point, if any of them actually like leverage the newfound market share to build out more revenue driving opportunities like subscriptions and stuff like that. I don't know. We could probably talk about this for an entire episode, but we do have to move on to Africa. More specifically, what has happened recently as Y Combinator has pulled back its investment and interest in African-based startups. So I want to give a quick history before I hand it off to Margaux. About 4 years ago, Y Combinator kind of made a splash in Africa. They turned their attention to the continent. They began accepting startups from the region into its cohorts. But now it seems YC has sort of reshuffled its deck of priorities and is interested in other things like manufacturing and defense tech. And no African startup made it into Y Combinator's most recent summer batch. So Margaux, what was the driving factor there? Please fill us in. What happened?
YC has changed so much since 2020 when they made that splash with African startups. At that point, they were bloated to almost 400 startups per cohort. They were doing at least partially. At some point it was totally remote and then it was partially remote. Now they have Gary Tan as the president. They've made a huge switch. It's back to in person. The cohorts are getting smaller. And yeah, they invested in their first defense tech startup. And they put out a call for more defense tech American dynamism startups to apply. So yeah, the DNA of YC, I think in a lot of ways has reverted back to its original DNA.
I'm normally kind of, just pessimistic about everything in general, but I wonder if this is actually potentially a good scenario where, YC taking an interest in Africa helped sort of stimulate interest in accelerators and startups there. But ultimately, the people who can really nurture this ecosystem are probably not people who are doing it remotely from San Francisco, but people who actually know the different markets there. Am I being like too Pollyannish, or is there a reason for hope?
The piece talks about how there are a lot of local accelerators that have filled the gap, but it also talks about how, like, there's a quote in here from one of the accelerators saying the YC of Africa is still YC. Like, it's going to take a long time, if ever, that you replicate that prestige and that success. But he also talks about, he was like, a lot of these accelerators are a step to YC, right? Like, it's don't view it as we're going to make the next YC, view it as we're going to teach you how this venture capital world works. We're going to give you a lot of local support so that you can go break out into the global market and be a more appealing and attractive candidate.
It's interesting to me because, I spent a lot of time focused on startups in Israel because of their focus on mobility. And they were almost right off the bat, not looking to do any kind of service or product that would serve specifically Israel. It was like the rest of the marketplace. And as a result, they might have like local accelerators, but they were looking for outside investment. But what happened was, because there was such a hub of activity, all the major automakers set up like venture arms, or at least offices, in Tel Aviv. And granted, it's a much more compact place to be. Africa is a massive continent. But in terms of hubs of activity, I wonder if what will happen here is, to Anthony's somewhat optimistic-ish view, is if this sort of concentration on getting more local accelerators will drum up more interest, and forget about YC, if just other corporate family offices, large manufacturers that have venture arms will start taking an interest in like actually setting up offices in Africa. It's not the same as, getting into a YC cohort, but I'm wondering if that will be sort of how this evolves. I don't know if you have any insight into this at all.
I mean, not particularly. I hope so. Obviously, Israel is such a unique country because there are so many ties with the US. You have a lot of VCs that are Israeli. I think it's going to be kind of a long tail. Like, you need to have a few big successes from Africa, which there have been, but you need more, and you need those people to then pump money back in. So there have been accelerators that have set up as YC's pulled out, but it's kind of a bummer because it's still a big deal. Again, YC is still YC. Like, it's still a big deal for them to elevate those startups, even if they need more local support as well.
Yeah, there are some large Africa-focused funds. Partech Africa is one, Algebra Ventures, that have collectively raised something like about $1 billion to invest into the continent, but those have not necessarily been all deployed. That, to me, shows some upside and in a good trajectory. I might have a little bit of a China question for you, though. I was just recently in Africa, actually. And one of the things on the non-venture side, but on the, let's say, China influence side of things, is infrastructure. China is all over Africa. Any road that's being built, it's a Chinese company. And I'm wondering if you're hearing from the communities you talk to, if there are interests in Chinese companies or startups or accelerators or any investments coming from China into startups in Africa, if we're seeing it at that like lower level.
That's a good question. I don't have an answer to that specifically, but I have thought a lot about China and Africa. I've met a ton of startups recently that are like American Dynamism in El Segundo, where all these guys are, that are focusing on mining and that are getting a lot of VC attention because they're like, we want to push out the fact that China owns all the mines for precious minerals in Africa. So that's a dynamic at play with China and Africa. I don't know specifically with Chinese money going into Africa. I do know that there's a lot of Chinese money in the Middle East. I've talked to sources that are off fundraising for their funds from Middle East LPs. And they're like, we run into, big Chinese funds everywhere we go. So there's definitely competition in many regions with Chinese venture money and American venture money.
Well, I think that's all we have for today. So thank you, Margaux. Always there with the China and Middle East hawkishness and insights. Always love that.
Thank you. Love to talk about it.
And Anthony, thanks for your insights again. And I will say that I am older than you, so you are making me feel young by talking about how you feel old. So thank you so much for that in your social media breakdown today.
Wow, I was not expecting that, but I'm happy to be here to make you feel young.
Yeah, thank you. Equity will be back next week, but until then, you can find Equity under the handle at EquityPod on X and Threads. Bye.
Equity is produced by Theresa Loconsolo with editing by Kel. Bryce Durbin is our illustrator, and we'd like to give a big thanks to our audience development team and Henry Pickavett, who manages TechCrunch audio products. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.